You might remember in the prologue to Polanyi and Meditations, Poteat talks about not giving his students a handout so that their faces can work their maieutic magic on his own presentation. So I want to see some magic out there from you people. The title of my paper is Fertile Ground and Point of Departure, Poteat's Use of Polanyi. Both of those terms, of course, are Bill's terms referring to Polanyi. The fertile ground suggests the way in which Polanyi provided a kind of immediate and direct help to Bill. Point of departure marks that way in which Bill went beyond Polanyi. In 1874, at the Paris studio of the photographer Nadar, a group of French painters, ostracized by the art establishment, exhibited paintings revealing a new approach to seeing the world and to rendering that vision in art. Louis Leroy was the art critic for the weekly paper Le Charivari, and he expressed the view of most of society by describing the show and its shared technique of impressionisme as outrageous, including works by the artists Manet, Pissarro, Degas, Renoir, Monet, and Paul Cézanne. Like each presenter at this conference who tries to communicate the meaning of Bill Poteat's work, I sympathize completely with Louis Leroy. He is us. Here is an earlier draft of the beginning of my paper. As part of Session 3's focus on Poteat's relation to Michael Polanyi, this paper first surveys quite briefly those places where Poteat chose to develop his own position in Polanyian language and structures, that from Diane Yeager, and then focuses on Poteat's contribution to philosophy beyond Polanyi, due first to to weaknesses in Polanyi's approach, secondly, to radical implications of Polanyi's thought, which remained hidden for most readers, but which Poteat sought to excavate, and three, finally, to Poteat's distinctive motifs, which cannot be found in Polanyi's work per se. This, of course, is a ridiculous goal for a short paper, but what I want you to notice is the treasonous spirit of the paragraph. Laid out for you there in that second opening is a plan conceived in the philosophy classes of my youth, which were hopelessly enthralled to the very critical perspective that both Polanyi and Poteat wanted to overcome. Those at this conference are familiar with this problem. We see it in Kierkegaard's indirect method, in Wittgenstein's acknowledgement of the strangeness of his work, in Poteat's analysis of the residual Cartesianism of Popper, Steiner, Percy, and in his repeated warnings that he is not doing philosophy in the usual way and should not be read that way. Indeed, he says at one point, quote, "dropping out is the most radical philosophical feat," unquote. And Poteat certainly dropped out of the professional guild of philosophy in many ways. So let me suggest that one of the themes most to be engaged in understanding Polanyi and Poteat, one of the central emblems of his work, is this irony, this indirection, this double vision that permeates everything Poteat writes about Michael Polanyi and much of other topics as well. As Poteat himself put it in a strange biographical note he wrote for Duke Divinity School, quote, "The fact that I have said that all of this about myself is so makes all of it to be somewhat less than so," unquote. More about this later. Fertile ground. Bill Poteat himself stated it clearly, "My debt to Polanyi is profound and conspicuous." We also have a discussion of Poteat's relation to Polanyi, probed in 8 perceptive papers in edition of Tradition and Discovery a few years ago, devoted to, quote, "the philosophies of William Poteat and Michael Polanyi," unquote. So my best advice on this topic is reread the prologue to Polanyian Meditations and review TAD, Volume 35, Number 2, carefully. But let me lift out a few of the items that caught my eye in that symposium, particularly in Diane Yeager's article, but this is by no means a complete list. From Polanyi's deeply interiorized motifs, Poteat stresses the following. First, knowledge and action are grounded in faith, in the tacit commitments and subsidiary clues upon which the knower must rely in order to make any claim about the world. Here Polanyi provided a well-argued response to the assumption of modern philosophy that only absolutely certain conclusions, arrived at through radical skepticism, could be called knowledge. Poteat speaks in one place of the cloud under which A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth, and Logic put the humanities, and clearly he saw Polanyi's work as a lifeline to those struggling to preserve the sensibleness of non-scientific language. A second Polanyian contribution to Poteat's program was his insistence on the dynamic character of knowing, a process best exemplified in discovery, creativity, and action, rather than in the purely ideational products of concepts and theories. Knowing is an intellectual passion, a heuristic enterprise by which the seeker gropes toward a revelatory unfolding of the only now known. Yeager perceptively notes that Polanyi's term heuristic passion also, this is a quote from Diane, also gave Poteat a name for his own driving, striving, searching, restless journey, unquote, which strikes me as a very apt description of Poteat's manner of being, at least as I encountered it. A third way in which Polanyi helped Poteat was in providing greater resources for the recovery of personal agency in philosophical discourse. Poteat's interest in the later Wittgenstein and ordinary language philosophy had already alerted him to the importance of restoring the first-person pronoun to the center of epistemology. But Polanyi's discussion of emergence helped Poteat see the possibility of recasting the reflective I as the composite, thoroughly temporal mind-body that dominates his late books. Indeed, Yeager argues that, quote, this attempt to give some sort of philosophical account of agency, and therefore freedom, constitutes Poteat's most distinctive and most significant contribution, unquote. Finally, Poteat is struck by the confessional mode which Polanyi employs in personal knowledge, and that is precisely the mode that he himself employs in his late books. Roughly one-third of his essay, upon first sitting down to read personal knowledge, is devoted to a discussion of the rhetorical device of confession and its implications. The use of the first-person singular pronoun is a solecism, of course, for critical intellectual discourse, announcing as it does that one has not placed private personal intuitions under the judgment of universal objective standards. And so the persistent use of I in Poteat's late books confirms Polanyi's claims about personal knowledge, displays Poteat's owning of responsibility for what he has written, and signals to the reader that a different is present here. We could, of course, greatly extend this Polanyian list of Polanyian contributions to Poteat. While Mead states that, quote, the real genius of Poteat, to my thinking, is this determined effort to eliminate the stark dichotomy of the inner self and the outer world, and therefore the split between mind and body, unquote. Polanyi only sometimes overcame this. Ron Hall has pointed out that Poteat's reservations about the universal application of Wittgenstein's model of language games probably comes from Polanyi's steadfast emphasis on the person as speaker as the center of language. And though Poteat does not take this step, one might conclude with Rush Rees. Hall suggests that conversation is a better model for language than games. Kieran Cashel sees Polanyi's as, quote, ubiquitous. It informs everything at an infrastructural level, unquote. Using Polanyi's terminology, Cashel labels the relationship of Poteat to Polanyi as an apprenticeship, suggesting that Polanyi in Meditations is a written report on the embodied epistemology that Poteat saw in Polanyi. He goes so far as to say that, quote, Poteat's authorship is mediated Polanyi, unquote. These brief pointings to various treatments of Polanyi and Poteat do not do them justice, of course, but perhaps they can serve to indicate the rich and varied resonances that have been heard between the two men, resonances that we should not attempt to see too clearly, or of course we should not see at all. The second of my assignments was to sketch Poteat's contributions to philosophy beyond Polanyi, and I'll now try to do that. Point of departure. First, Poteat's dis-ease with critical philosophy began a few years before he read Polanyi in his dissertation on Pascal and Descartes, an emblem of the first difference between the two men, namely the depth and reach of Poteat's cultural background in the humanities, perhaps parallel in some way to Polanyi's competence in science. As Gus Breitsprock put it, there's a much broader and deeper agenda being set in Poteat's early work than he found in Polanyi, an agenda that incorporates philosophy, literature, art, and theology, as well as a good bit of Freud, and enabled him to develop personal knowledge far beyond Polanyi. One small example, consider Poteat's identification at the beginning of Recovering the Ground of the problem of critical philosophy as Gnosticism. Quote, I gaze northeastward across the Atlantic, and I wonder, can we survive our millennial addiction to Gnostic apocalypticism? Gnosticism, older than the Western world, an ever-present religion deep in the Western soul, is the belief that men and women are pure spirits, now held captive in the prison of this world created by an evil demiurge from which alone esoteric gnosis can set them free, unquote. Gnosticism, of course, is not a Polanyian term, but to anyone in the humanities, particularly in religion or philosophy, it is rich in connotations, allusions, reverberations that quite easily extend the discussion of critical philosophy in new directions. Poteat's humanism both enables his reaction to critical philosophy and also enhances that reaction beyond what could be accomplished by the scientist or the philosopher alone. And his acute reading of text, of Karl Popper, of George Steiner, of Walter Percy, shows this, I think, very well. Second, I want to recall for you a comment made in class by Poteat, probably in the fall of 1971, that Polanyi had little sense of the tragic. Poteat's reference, as I remember it, was to Polanyi's time in Austin, Texas, the previous spring, where he gave what would be his last series of lectures, and Gus has already talked about this some. Polanyi had just celebrated his 80th birthday, and according to Scott and Molesky in the biography, quote, Polanyi was aware that his ability to marshal details in a coherent argument was fading. Poteat found conversations increasingly exhausting, since he was expected to supply what Polanyi was unable to remember, unquote. Poteat's reference to this experience in class was to Polanyi's having invested his entire life in intellectual activity, and now that his mind was going, he did not know what to do. He had no resources, personal or professional, to cope with such an eventuality, and was increasingly depressed about it. My memory is that Poteat was referring to the absence of a religious faith in Polanyi adequate to this time of life, and also to the essentially Enlightenment confidence in reason that has sustained Polanyi for so long. Of course, we should be very careful about assessing a person at this time of life, since none of us knows how we will respond to a similar situation. But I think there's at least some truth in Poteat's observation. I've looked at the boxes in the Polanyi archive at Chicago that deal with the period of World War II and just afterward, and found no sustained attention by Polanyi to the Holocaust, despite the fact that many of his own family members lost their lives in the camps, and almost all of them suffered terrible disruptions in their lives, many ending as exiles, Polanyi himself did. Polanyi tried to help some of them find shelter and work in England or America, but while the war caused him to write energetically about the political and economic challenges caused by authoritarian governments, there is silence about what was perhaps the greatest tragedy of that bloody century, the destruction of the European Jews. Personal Knowledge, published 13 years after the end of the war, contains numerous references to dictatorship and totalitarianism, but very few to the destructiveness of these regimes, particularly vis-à-vis the Jews. In contrast, the shadow side of life was a real concern for Bill Poteat, as can be seen particularly in the early essays, Tragedy and the Absence of God, Anxiety, Courage, and Truth, as well as later essays like Persons and Places. And it may be that the banality of evil also would be one of those. He writes, quote, "For us, knowledge tends to be associated with heroism and unqualified beatitude. Yet it has not always been held, nor is it true. A deeper human sensibility has shown that truth is not only won at a price, but painful when won. That knowledge is always an ambiguous good, concealing a threat. That catastrophe is associated with the loss of innocence." Unquote. He then takes us through the myth of Oedipus, the myth of Adam, and the myth of Faust, in order to show the relevance to human knowing of the various forms of darkness. And while this is not a concern of the last three books, I cannot believe it's entirely absent from any of Poteat's writings, and that's not true of Michael Polanyi. A third way in which I see a distinctive difference between Polanyi and Poteat is in the latter's awareness of the degree to which all of Western thought has been warped, truncated, distorted by the critical temperament, such that a new language is necessary to oppose it. Poteat had suggested, upon first sitting down to read Personal Knowledge, that Polanyi's difficulty for new readers was precisely his use of terms according to a post-critical sensibility. But in his own work, this feature is raised or deepened to the level of a central motif. This is the feature of irony, of suspicion, referred to as I began my remarks, and it's been well explored by Dale Cannon, who identifies it with Kierkegaard's double reflection. Quote, "Largely from Kierkegaard, I believe," Dale writes, "Poteat early on learned that the human condition is, and fundamental concepts about it are accordingly through and through dialectical. Nothing is simply what it seems to be on the surface, particularly not what it appears to be to detached objective reflection. What is needed is a sensitivity to the ironic possibilities in existence. Unless a person becomes aware of and sensitive to this, she or he is liable to misunderstand and mistake what Poteat was all about and what he found in Polanyi." Unquote. As Poteat makes clear in the prolegomena to Recovering the Ground, the style of his later works was intentional and, I might even say, aggressive. Here's a characteristic example. The present essay is not about anything. In its style, awkward syntax, nonlinear progression, reflexivity, dialectical reduplication, and unfamiliar, often deliberately atonal diction congested with what will appear to be pretentious or merely clever coinages that together allow my radical insight lucidly to oppose itself to the conceptual landscape from which it has been elicited and to impede yet another bemused lap into our familiar dualisms, I have obeyed the demand upon me of this primitive reality to educe and then body forth the logos that endows my mind-body with sentience, motility, and orientation, both before I have yet spoken and after I do, as itself the condition of speech." Unquote. This is not a sentence that tries to woo his reader. to lead them gently into a colloquy with Poteat. He continues the explanation of his style by comparing his reader to a beholder of Cézanne's paintings and claims his text is like a fully developed Cubist painting. His aim, therefore, is, quote, to place the reader in an agonistic relation to the text. The rhetoric seeks by reduplication to embody dynamically, in its own tension, the actual intentional structure of our feats of knowing, unquote. Cannon very helpfully comments on this reduplication. Its point is to get us, Poteat's readers or audience, to focus on the content of reflection, the what, but also to become aware of our own state of mind and life as we relate existentially to that content, the how. When practicing such double reflection, we should gradually become aware of the cultural means, the pictures, metaphors, assumptions, with which we rely in our reflection on the what and how they distort our understanding. Quote, they skew our take upon the world and abstract us from ourselves, unquote. As my first quote from Cannon indicated, this double reflection extends deep into the human condition. Quote, all truth as truth, considered existentially, is inherently and essentially dialectical, unquote. That is, truth's disclosure of itself is directly dependent on the knower's relationship to that truth, on her authenticity and passion. To say that truth is subjectivity is to point to this feature that makes it impossible to objectively, distantly, coolly, dispassionately, detachedly understand truth. To do so would be to focus on the what and ignore the how. This was fundamental to Poteat. Sometimes Polanyi was aware of and sensitive to this, Cannon says, at other times he was not. And that is, in large measure, Cannon continues, where the difference between the two men lies. That Poteat was sensitive to the how of doing philosophy is easily seen in his last three books, where he adopts a distinctively new style of philosophical reflection. In the introduction to the daybook, Poteat describes his method. What I began to do in 1987 was to sit down in my study every morning and in a leather-bound book of blank pages write down my reflections upon whatever philosophical perplexity was made to surface as I tried to learn what my way of thinking had become. For myself, these pages are an attempt to represent a new certain style of dwelling in one's mind, body, and the world. I have therefore avoided editorial tampering with what was written in the longhand draft, hoping thereby to keep you as close as I found I had to keep myself to the concrete, agonistic, fully mind-bodily activity of putting words upon the page in my own fair hand, which is, after all, one of the things that thinking is, unquote. By the way, there are some wonderful extensions of this discussion of his manner of writing in letters to Jim Steins that are in the archive now at Yale. I just read them yesterday, didn't have time to incorporate them, but they're great. Not only have Poteat's ideas about philosophy changed, but also his understanding of how one should do philosophy. It should be done consistently with one's mind-bodily being. Everything must serve real life, that is, life that is potent with the unacknowledged configurations of meaning, coherence, order, and value, unquote. The writing longhand, the dating of each entry, the continuing to write only so long as a train of thought continues, the refusal to edit the text for the sake of some Cartesian conceit, all of these were stratagems for avoiding a relapse into Cartesianism. The result is clear. Quote, it will be immediately obvious that this is no work of scholarship. What I aspire for you is the same thing I have sought for myself, growing consolidation in a post-critical mode of mind-bodily being, unquote. One last innovation of language should be mentioned, namely the crucial term mind-body. The stimulus and conversation partner in this particular move is probably not Polanyi, but Merleau-Ponty, in his exploration of the irreducible coherency of body, mind, and perception in the phenomenology of perception. Through his own phenomenological examination of his bodily being in thinking, writing, bike riding, and playing tennis, Poteat reveals the insidious tendency of the critical tradition to make us think of our body as a thing like other things, when in fact it is for us radically unlike anything else in the universe. These phenomenological analyses, an excellent example would be Poteat's analysis of his act of reading a paragraph in the Meditations, are original contributions to a revisioning of philosophy and help demonstrate what mind-body looks like in ordinary experience. Poteat's description of incarnate knowing, characterized by the temporal, the embodied, and the oral imagination, tends to assume greater and greater importance for Poteat as time goes on. Quote, "Our mind-bodies, among whose existential modalities are form, order, meaning, and beauty, are the paradigms of the real," unquote. The mind-body is the center from which all our stretching forth toward the world commences. Fourth, beyond noting the language used in Poteat's writings, we must also remember that a major way in which he extends Polanyian thought is in his placing speech at the center of our mind-bodily being. And I want to thank Ron Hall particularly for focusing on this. Let me remind you of a couple of facets of this theme. First, Poteat's early writings show a keen awareness of the need to insist that a speaker is an agent whose existence cannot be reduced or assimilated to its behavior. Since the eye of human speech is systematically elusive and logically unique. Surely Pascal and Kierkegaard have predisposed Poteat to this defense of the self against those who, like Gilbert Ryle, would efface all interiority. Another of the real strengths of Polanyian meditations is the way that Bill uses contemporary research in orality by linguist and anthropologist Jack Goody, Walter Ong, Joseph Church, Colwyn Trevarthen, and William Condon to extend and deepen his claim that it is in the oral world of speech that language has its primitive home, rather than in the world of written texts. He contrasts this at every point with the picture of language bequeathed us by the visual model of knowledge that underlies the critical tradition, in which the world is rendered in a dead slice of visual space that systematically eliminates the temporal dynamic place in which persons have their natural home. Finally, I think that for Poteat, the quality of language, particularly human speech, that makes it such a powerful constituent of our humanity is its metaphorical richness. In the many etymological excursions in the Meditations, he is signaling the many layers of intention, orientation, and implication contained in our speech that binds our mind-body together with that of others, and so makes both knowing and communication possible. It is not clarity, as Cartesianism claimed, that denotes knowledge, but richness of meaning. And revealing and celebrating this is the burden and the glory of the humanities. I have gone on too long and yet said not nearly enough. But this will have to do for now, and I will simply close with the instruction, read his books.
First, I'll you first, but I first Dale, so that we're all playing by the same rules. How late can we be for dinner?
Well, dinner was originally scheduled for 6. I just wanted to, 6. So let's go till 28.
28. So that gives us half an hour for discussion, and we can go back to some of the earlier presentations where discussions were cut off, as well as discussing most recently. So, yeah, let's get started.
Thank you for your paper. I was most interested in your reference to difference between Poteat and Polanyi in terms of the tragic and Polanyi's lack of a religious faith. And I recently read the Molesky Scott biography, which emphasized that. And I have to say I found it very puzzling, because the one thing that I remember about Polanyi that Poteat told me was that Polanyi carried the Book of Common Prayer with him at all times. Now, perhaps this was just some aesthetic affectation, but it seems an odd aesthetic affectation.
What does that have to do with faith? I'm sorry.
Well, Poteat tells the story, excuse me, when he came to Duke, Polanyi says, "Are we going to divine worship this morning?" And he literally took Poteat to divine worship, so there's that. That was that part of it.
Yeah, so, and not that I remember reading the biography really that closely, but I don't recall any reference to these kind of things that Poteat told various people, and it's just, I just find it odd that this would be such a thing that Poteat emphasized, and yet the biography treats as if it wasn't there. So can you sort that out at all? Do you have any clue?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't say Poteat emphasized this. It was one comment he made in class, fairly extended comment, but that I thought was revelatory of Polanyi. Note also that I didn't say Polanyi was without faith, but that for Poteat, he didn't seem to have religious resources adequate to that time in his life. I think Poteat saw it as a sadness, but Polanyi was a scientist who really was dedicated to furthering the accomplishments of human reason. And I think when his own mind began to go, that was a problem. I mean, of course, we'll all be caught with that. That is, when our mind begins to go, we won't have the mental faculties to solve the problem. So,
Or to know the problem.
while he's older than I am, so he speaks from experience. But I think that's a good point, John, and I certainly wouldn't want to overemphasize that, but I was talking about the sense of the tragic.
You know, but another element of this, you know, there's something, for example, like Oliver Sacks raises in many of his works, about people with various neurological deficits, right? Can suddenly burst into prayer or into singing hymns, right? Or can join in. And singing particularly seems to occupy a very different kind of part of the mind. I won't say brain. And it just, you know, with all this primordial understanding of ourselves, pre our kind of rational faculties and all these other aspects, I'm puzzled that apparently Polanyi was devoid of these things, and that in the Poteat's interaction with the Polanyi, this wouldn't have come up. I don't know, I find it very puzzling.
I don't think he was.
He wasn't devoid of them. In the biography, there are some very poignant passages where Polanyi reflects on one thing, the beauty of the Lord's Prayer, and other in that same context, how he wanted to believe these things, but he didn't, and he really was caught up a little bit, I think, by one of the British logical positivists, and he felt he couldn't say that factually some of this stuff was true, but it was true in the sense that for him, and that it reflects somehow the whole depth of the life he wanted. And
So it's almost like saying Polanyi couldn't work through the own implications of his own fundamental convictions about personal knowledge, and he still had remnants of his positivism that he was trying to debunk in science when it came to his faith or religious issues in his life.
Go ahead, hand up early.
I just wanted to comment on this, and not develop it further. My own sense in relationship to this issue, and I'm really glad you raised it the way you did, but is that for Polanyi, I think that in some respects it's not just that he didn't have the resources, that says it in a certain way, but that he had them, but he hadn't been able to get how to put them together, and part of what was is, yes, maybe some of the carryover, the positivism, but some of it is just simply coming to a position where he could attain the grace of faith or whatever. He just wanted it. He expressed an interest in getting there, but he wasn't able to make it.
My question.
Somewhere,
Here first.
I think he was next in line.
Chairman,
my question is kind of obliquely related to this, and I'm worried about this, and I'm just asking for your speculations on it. Why does the Polanyi Society meet with the AAR instead of the APA? And why is it that somehow Polanyi has been more welcomed by the religious community
That's the reason.
and simply just rebuffed by the philosophical community? And I'm just asking for your speculations on that.
oh, I think it's an excellent question. I've wondered the same thing.
Excuse me, what are those, what are AA,
Well, it's too late for you.
The
American Automobile Association.
And the APA is the American Psychological, no, I mean Philosophical Association.
What about the AA?
Marty Molesky has an article. He takes as his title, "The Man Who Fell Among Theologians." And that phrase was used of Polanyi in a negative sense. Marjorie Green felt that it was really unfortunate that Polanyi was being studied primarily by people with a religious interest. But philosophers have not shown that same kind of interest. And it may be that the critical temperament, positivism, is not the same kind of problem for them. Really, for religious studies, it seems to me, positivism is a life or death struggle. If you don't solve that problem in the modern academy, you are defunct. And so maybe people sensed in Polanyi a much more important and richer resource than philosophers would have sensed.